This is the second excerpt of my recent webinar on my Patreon channel called The State of the Union. If you're interested in checking out the content there, the link is in the description below. In this snippet, in this excerpt, I'm going to be talking about foreign affairs, specifically the challenges that China and Russia present to the United States at this time. So please check it out, and I hope you enjoy it. In serious trouble. Now, foreign affairs. In foreign affairs, the United States has essentially two countries that are major challenges for it, and one region that's a major challenge for it. The two countries are China and Russia, and the region that's a challenge for it is the Middle East. Now, what's going on with China? Well, China is reasserting itself. China has self-consciously decided that they are going to be the #1 power in the world. And they have made up their minds. The Communist Party of China has just decided that, fuck yeah, we're going to be, China #1, and US #2. On a purchasing power parity scale, the Chinese economy is already larger than the American. Okay, on a nominal basis, no, it's about 2/3, I think, at this point. It doesn't really matter. On a nominal basis, it will eventually outstrip the American economy. Okay, now the Chinese they see themselves as a future great power. And they see that themselves self-consciously as emerging from the ashes of Mao and the Cultural Revolution and the Civil War and the whole period of the 20th century and the 19th century. Because do keep in mind, China has always been a great power. Yeah, because it's always been the largest country in the world. And they were a great power, a great empire for the longest time. And the times that they were conquered, like for instance by the Mongols, well, the Mongols conquered the Chinese, but the Chinese essentially co-opted the Mongols and created out of them the Yuan dynasty and continued on. Chinese civilization is incredibly robust, and they have been an empire throughout most of their history. The last 2 centuries, the 19th and 20th century, that's an aberration. And the Chinese Communist Party feels that they are finally making good on what China ought to be, which is a great power. They have a navy that currently has more ships than the United States, although it has a lot less tonnage. They don't have any nuclear aircraft carriers, which are exceedingly important in the American defense strategy, because those aircraft carriers project enormous power, in a very short order. I mean, you can get one ship to go to the other side of the world, one carrier task group to go to the other side of the world in just a couple of weeks. And all of a sudden you have essentially a floating military base with, 100 aircraft that are exceedingly deadly, and you can project power internationally, within just a few days. Okay. Because the United States has 13 carrier battle groups scattered around the world. So the United States has enormous military resources, but the Chinese are reasserting themselves, and they want that. They want to. The Communist Party and Chairman Xi very much wants to show the Chinese people and themselves that they were the one who brought back the glory of China. Okay, it's a big deal for them, an ego thing for them. Now, when you have that kind of a mentality, okay. That kind of self-confidence, that kind of sense of manifest destiny, self-confidence, basically, you're unstoppable. When the United States had that sense of self-confidence during the 19th century, manifest destiny and all that shit, the period between 1965 and, 1865, the end of the Civil War, and roughly, I would say 2001, that sense of real self-confidence, that there's nothing that America could not do. You can accomplish great things. But over the last couple of decades, and especially over the last 10 years, since the start of the first Obama administration, the United States' sense of self-confidence has deteriorated radically. And it's because of different things that I'll get into in just a moment. But the point, the Chinese feel that it's their time, that the wave of history is on their side, that they're surfing this wave to a very high mark. Okay. And what they are, their principal concern is Taiwan. And people in the United States, and a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment do not understand this, that the United States, that China, the obsession that China has is Taiwan. In the first conversations between the United States and China in the 1970s, when they were doing the effort at rapprochement, right? And they were paving the way for Nixon's trip to China, which was a big deal. See, the first thing that the Chinese said was they wanted the United States to cut ties with Taiwan, diplomatic ties, and take them off the United Nations. And it was their price for rapprochement, okay? And the United States decided that China is a nuclear power, the largest country in the world. And so therefore, what they were going to do is they were going to sell out the Taiwanese and humor the Chinese, because for the Chinese, the loss of Taiwan is they can't get over it. Okay, it's like there's nothing equivalent for the United States. But imagine if, just say for the sake of argument, that Florida became like an independent country. Okay, and its government and its people were antagonistic to the rest of the country. Okay, and the rest of the country wanted to capture Florida, but it couldn't because geography, military, and also Florida has big allies with other countries. I mean, it would drive the rest of the United States nuts, right? That's the exact problem. See, Taiwan, for those of you who don't know, was where during the Chinese Civil War that ended in 1949, well, the losers, who were the nationalists, the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek, led by Chiang Kai-shek, they moved to Taiwan. They retreated to Taiwan. And all of the people who were against the communists, who were persecuted by communists, went to Taiwan. And Taiwan has become a powerhouse, economically speaking. And militarily, they're not pushovers. A lot of people sort of like discount the Taiwanese, but the Taiwanese know that China wants to conquer them, militarily conquer them, invade them, okay? In fact, the Chinese, in some city of theirs, they have actually built a full-scale replica of the Taiwanese presidential palace, and they carry out exercises in this full-scale replica, military exercises of how they would conquer it, okay? I mean, that's how much they want Taiwan, okay? It's an ego thing for them, okay? And especially now that the Chinese economy is so powerful, it's a big deal for them. Now, why does this matter? Well, see, Taiwan in and of itself, I mean, who gives a shit? It's just an island out in the China Sea. Who gives a fuck? But the problem is that the global economy depends on Taiwan to an inordinate extent because they manufacture semiconductor chips. And many of the most important ones, many of the most basic ones, okay, for the little everyday appliances, okay? And because of globalization, there has been a concentration of manufacturing in different spots in the world, taking advantage of comparative advantage, the economic theory that sometimes it is better to outsource a particular piece of a particular product to some other country that is more efficient producing them, okay, as opposed to you trying to produce everything. It's basically the theory that you should focus on what you're good at, and which makes sense. It's like, for instance, I mean, you're a lawyer and you charge $500 an hour, for instance, right? And you know how to fix a toilet, no problem. But are you going to waste your time fixing a toilet and not earn $500 as a lawyer? No, you're going to hire a plumber, because the plumber is going to charge you $75. You could do it for $0, but the time you waste is time that you could have spent and earned $500 an hour. So that's why you hire the plumber, even though you can do it. See, that's roughly what the notion of comparative advantage is, the theory of it. And so what's happened in the global economy is that comparative advantage has been, it's wall-to-wall comparative advantage. And the Taiwanese have not a monopoly, but certainly they are a dominant player in the chip manufacturing business of all kinds of chips. And this is a problem. If the chips coming out of Taiwan are interrupted, okay, those shipments get cut because of the war, it'll have a huge impact on the global economy because we are so dependent on the little fucking screens, on our computers, our laptops, our iPads, our iPhones and Androids and all that shit. So it's a big fucking deal if they invade Taiwan. I mean, God knows what could happen, but the Chinese, they want it so bad. Now, And they also they want some trivial islands and the oceans off the coast of Japan. And Japan is not putting up with it. And there's historical enmity between the Chinese and the Japanese that goes way beyond the Second World War. It goes back 1,000 years. They hate each other's guts. They always will. Okay. They both look at each other as fucking savages. Okay. And so they hate each other, and that's that. There's nothing to be done. Okay. So China is reasserting itself. Now, this is very dangerous for the United States because the Chinese, they know that America is weak, especially now that Trump is gone and Biden's in charge. A few weeks ago, the Chinese emissaries met with American emissaries from the State Department in Alaska, and the Chinese basically bitch slapped them in their home turf. I mean, it was really fucking embarrassing. I mean, just like bitch slapped them around, man. I mean, if that had been like how like a man treats his wife, the guy would have been charged for spousal abuse. I mean, that kind of a bitch slapping. That's what it was. It was like the worst, to add insult to injury. It was on American home turf, and the impotence of the State Department guy and the Secretary of State. His name slips my mind right now. He looked like a fucking bitch ass pussy, like a fucking loser cunt. I mean, like a cum chugger to the 10th degree, for crying out loud. Okay. So the Chinese, they got the Biden-Harris administration pegged. They see them as weaklings. Okay. And this is a problem because they're not scared of the United States, not under the Harris or Biden-Harris administration. And so that means if they view the United States, Taiwan's principal ally, as weak, they might decide to pull the trigger and take over Taiwan, at an opportune moment. And maybe they create that opportune moment. You know what I'm saying? So this is very, very dangerous. Now, Russia, on the other hand, and a lot of people asked about Russia and Ukraine and all that shit, and I'm going to talk about it right now. Now, Russia is being needlessly provoked by the U.S. via Ukraine, right? Because the Americans created the 2014 color revolution in Ukraine that overthrew Poroshenko and all that shit, right? And now the president of Ukraine is a fucking clown. Literally, he's a comedian. I'm not kidding. He's an actual comedian. He used to be a comedian on TV. In fact, he had a show on where he played a school teacher who, by fortuitous circumstances, wound up being president of Ukraine. It was a fucking comedy. And this fucker, Zelensky, actually became the fucking president of Ukraine. Everybody despises him now. It's a big disaster. But anyway, it was like a protest vote against the previous guy. And now Ukraine has him, and he's a fucking joke. He's a literal clown. And, the Russians, they're being needlessly provoked because the U.S., it's a long story. And so let me, this is going to be a long fucking show, so fuck it. The story goes as follows. See, when the Soviet Union collapsed, before it had collapsed, it had built a number of gas pipelines between the gas fields in Russia and Europe and Turkey. And see, these gas pipelines went through Ukraine, which, of course, back then was part of the USSR. Now, of course, when the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became an independent nation in 1991. And so these pipelines all of a sudden are in Ukrainian sovereign territory. Now, the fees that Ukraine gets from the gas flowing through its pipelines is roughly 18% of the Ukrainian government's budget. I mean, these pipelines are a big fucking deal for the Ukrainians, okay? And when the Ukrainians, don't have the money to pay for gas because people need gas for the winter because it's fucking cold. It's fucking Ukraine, right? Well, sometimes they'll play games. The Ukrainians will play games with Russia and the pipeline, right? Now, it affects Russia and it pisses them off, but it also affects Europe. And the Germans were fucking sick and tired of this shit because the Germans, they depend on Russian gas that flowed through the Ukrainian pipelines, okay? And so the Germans very quietly decided, fuck these fuckers. Enough with these fucking Ukrainian dickheads who are fucking with our natural gas that we paid for, which we fucking need to heat our fucking homes and factories during the fucking winter. And so they created the Nord Stream pipelines. These pipelines, especially Nord Stream 2, which is about to be completed, go underneath the Baltic Sea. And it goes from Russia to Germany. No more having to go through Ukraine, okay? And this, of course, creates, it's something that the Americans don't like at all, because it creates a lot closer ties between Germany and Russia, see? Because before, the Germans were dealing with the Ukrainians, okay? The Ukrainians were the middlemen. The Ukrainians were the people who basically could step on that hose of natural gas going from Russia to Germany, Russia through Ukraine, through Poland, and all the rest of it, and distributed. Okay, it's complicated, but in a practical sense, right? And so the Americans were fine with this situation. Okay, the Ukrainians were fine with the situation. The Russians weren't too happy with it. The Germans weren't too happy with it. And do keep in mind, it's been 70 years since the Second World War. The Germans and the Russians, they see eye to eye on a lot of fucking shit, okay? Because Russia is the biggest, strongest country in Europe, but Germany is number 2, okay? And the Germans and the Russians, they pretty much agree on a whole boatload of shit, okay? And that's always been the issue, okay? Germany and Russia, historically, though they've been to war several times, but historically, their interests align more often than not. And it makes the Poles very nervous. It makes the Ukrainians very nervous. It makes everybody very nervous, because those are the two dominant powers. And if their interests align and they start acting in concert, then nobody's going to be able to put up any kind of resistance, right? The United States is not keen on the developing German-Russian relationship. And so what they decided to do is they've been trying to demonize Russia so as to halt Nord Stream 2. Now, Nord Stream 2 is going to happen because the Germans want it too badly, okay? And they're like, fuck America, basically, because they don't want to pay for America's natural gas, because the United States sells natural gas, right, in liquid form, and ships it on these big boats, right? But the thing is, see, it's much more expensive and much costlier, and I mean, it's costlier, but also much more involved and difficult to ship that gas than it is to get Russian gas. I mean, there's no question, it's just cheaper to get Russian gas. So why fuck around with American natural gas when you can get Russian? All you have to do is build this fucking pipeline. And so the Germans, being German, being very autistic and unwilling to see the big picture sometimes deliberately, they're like, fuck America, we're going to do this pipeline with the Russians, and we're going to be happy, and the Russians are going to be happy, and fuck you, America. And America doesn't like it. And so that's why they've been demonizing the Russians. That's why they've been demonizing Putin. Now, Putin's priority, okay, is something that you have to understand. Putin views the collapse of the Soviet Union as a catastrophe, not because communism fell apart. No, he doesn't give a shit about communism. He's not a communist, okay? He is a free marketeer. I mean, if he were like a regular politician in like the UK or the US, he'd be like a center-left right-winger, okay? He'd be like David Cameron. He'd be like, he's not like a hardcore conservative, right? I mean, he's pretty liberal in a lot of social issues, is my point. He's very nationalistic. Now, this nationalism springs from the fact that when the Soviet Union collapsed, what was it? 60 million Russians were suddenly living in foreign countries. And this, from his point of view, is a catastrophe, because he is a Russian nationalist. And he wants the Russian people to live in Russia. And see, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Kazakhstan and Ukraine and all these, Georgia and all these other republics emerged, all of a sudden you had 60 million Russians, ethnic Russians, were living outside of Russia. And his program is to get them unified, get them back into Russia. Because as far as he's concerned, they are Russian citizens, and he has an obligation to look after them and take care of them, okay? And Ukraine has a huge Russian population. And that's the core issue, because Ukraine, half of Ukraine is Ukrainian ethnically, and the other half is Russian ethnically. And so, like, the western half is Ukrainian, where they speak Ukraine, and the eastern half, where I live, is Russian, and they speak Russian. I mean, they actually have to make an effort to remember to speak Ukrainian, because officially Ukrainian is the official language of Ukraine, quite obviously. But the people here in Kharkov, where I live, in eastern Ukraine, which is basically 40 kilometers from the Russian border, well, they all speak Russian. They only speak Ukrainian when they're forced to, obliged to, because it's like an official thing or something. Okay, and they feel Russian, and that's a key issue. Okay, so what's going on right now? See, in 2014 there was a Maidan revolution, and it scared Putin enough that he decided to act. He didn't act out of fear, but he acted out of pragmatism. And he's a very pragmatic guy, a very smart guy. He's the best geopolitical chess player on the planet right now. I mean, he is the guy who knows how to move fucking pieces to get what he wants. And in 2014, the Americans pushed this color revolution. And what he decided to do is take advantage of the chaos, and he invaded Crimea. You look at the map, and Crimea is basically that peninsula that sticks out of the north of the Black Sea, right? The major city is Sevastopol. Now, what happens with Crimea? Well, see, the Russian Navy had leased Sevastopol from the Ukrainian government. And they needed Sevastopol because there they had their ships that could go onto the Black Sea, that could go onto the Mediterranean. I mean, the Black Sea is basically an Eastern European lake. And the Russians wanted control of the Black Sea, right? And the Ukrainians were playing fucking games, because that's the fucking problem with the Ukrainians. They keep playing games with the Russians, right? They keep thinking that they can be cleverer than the Russians, but the Russians are fucking big, and they don't fuck around. And so the Russians decided, fuck it, fuck these Ukrainians. And they went and invaded Crimea, and they took it over like in a week, okay? With very little fighting in Crimea. And also what they did was that they started supporting Russian nationalists in eastern Ukraine. Now, when you look at the map of Ukraine, this is southeastern, okay, around the city of Donbass and Lugansk, right? And they started supporting these separatists with weapons, with training, with logistics. And these separatists caused a lot of fucking problems for the Ukrainians, okay? There's basically 15% of Ukrainian landmass that they do not control. And so since 2014, there's been this, it's not really a war, but it's not peace either, okay? It's this low-level, fighting kind of thing, okay? But it's not like a real war. And the Russian army is certainly not involved, okay? This is a key issue. Now, the Russians, though, they're basically winning. That's the key issue. And so the Biden administration, they came in and they started putting sanctions on Russia, going apeshit over Russia, because not only do they not like this German-Russian alliance, they also want to basically foment a war, because there are a lot of economic interests, because the Ukrainians have hoarded themselves out to a lot of the deep state players in the United States. And, Hunter Biden situation, where he was on the board of Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company, what the fuck do you think that was? He was getting paid like $5 million a year or some shit like that. Yeah. To do what? To do nothing. Okay. He was being paid off so that Joe Biden would support the Ukrainians. I'm more to the point, make of Russia the enemy. Mm-hmm. And so what's happened as of late is that the Russians, they have amassed 60,000 troops in Crimea and another 60,000 troops in eastern Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian army has 250,000 soldiers, but the problem is that they're conscripts. They're conscripts, and they have very low morale, very low training. And the Russians, well, they have rebuilt their military. They are up to snuff. They can handle it. Anybody. They can fucking handle the Ukrainian army, no problem. They can wipe them out, okay? And everybody pretty much knows it, okay? If push comes to shove, the Russians could probably invade Ukraine and roll up the whole fucking country up until the Dnieper River. I mean, just take over the eastern half of it. Because if you look at a map of Ukraine, and I suggest you do, it's this weird kind of like sort of triangle-ish shaped country with the Dnieper River. It's Dnieper. The Dnieper River splits it from north to south, right? And at the very top of Ukraine, where the Dnieper River starts, that's where Kiev is located, right? Now, this river is really fucking wide. It's a natural barrier, okay? And it would be no trick at all for the Russians to roll in and take over half the country. There would be no trick for them at all. And they've basically been hinting at that, right? And that's why the Biden administration is going apeshit. But the reason that the Russians have been doing this is because the Biden administration and the Ukrainians have been provoking them. Specifically, in March, the Ukrainian government essentially said that its priority was to recapture Crimea. It was, in essence, though not in fact, a declaration of war against Russia, because they were saying, look, our priority is to recapture Crimea. And so basically, you know, and why did Zelensky's government issue this decree? Well, it was at the instigation of the Biden administration, because the Biden administration wants to start a war, because a war with Russia would solve all kinds of problems, okay? Because it would mean a lot of money for defense contractors. It would create an enemy, you know, and it's a known enemy, because, you know, it's like the good old days when the USSR was around. A clear enemy. They're evil. They're bad. They're the fucking Russians. Let's kill them, right? But the problem is that the Russians, they can take on the Americans. And in fact, they could wipe them out. Yeah. Because the Russians are more motivated and they're better led. Simple as that. Okay? And the Ukrainian army is 250,000 men, right? Paradoxically, that very large army would be an impediment to the United States, because it would basically get in their way. And so they would not be able to engage with the Russians. And the key issue, of course, there is no strategic interest that the United States has with Ukraine. Okay? If the United States were to like deploy troops from, say, Poland and send them east across Ukraine, right, to engage with the Russians, there's nothing to be won. But for the Russians, this is their home turf. Okay? This is their fucking backyard. Okay, imagine this. Imagine the Chinese, right, had amassed a whole bunch of troops on, you know, in Belize or Honduras, right, and they were causing problems in Mexico, and getting Mexico to start like antagonizing the U.S., poking the U.S., and basically saying, you know, we're going to have a war with you. We're going to do whatever the fuck we want. Okay, because the other issue too, of course, is that the Ukrainians are desperate to get into the European Union because they think they'll get free money, and they're desperate to get into NATO because they think that they'll be protected by the NATO umbrella. They'll be protected from Russia. It's Ukraine rather is basically that little kid that wants to be friends with a really big guy and taunt the bully. Okay. That's the situation of the Ukrainians. I mean, the Ukrainian leadership, man, they're pieces of shit. They're garbage. Okay, lovely people, but the worst fucking political leadership ever. Because they should have made friends with the Russians. That's what they should have done. They should have made friends with the Russians. Stop fucking with them. Make friends with Putin. Putin doesn't have any interest in invading invading Ukraine. Why not? Well, because see, if Russia were to invade Ukraine, it would have to administer this whole fucking country. It's a huge fucking piece of land. Ukraine is bigger than France, okay? Ukraine is a huge piece of territory. And so to administer it, to take it over, and to hold on to it, and then to have to fight against fucking, you know, terrorist guerrillas, you know, freedom fighters, call them what you will, you know, the resistance, the Ukrainian national resistance against the Russian oppressor, it would be endless. It would be just Afghanistan 2.0 for the Russians. They don't want that. They're not stupid. Okay. So the Russians are basically posturing. And the reason I'm pretty confident of this is because of the currency exchange. Like I said, I'm 40 kilometers from the Russian border. And the currency exchange of both the dollar and the euro, as well as the British pound, has been rock steady. There's no run on the currency. Nobody is getting rid of their hryvnias and trying to load up on foreign currency in preparation for a Russian invasion. Because, of course, if the Russians were to invade, the hryvnia would become worthless, right? Because you wouldn't be able to do it because you'd be under Russian administrative control. And so what would happen is that people would resort to the dollar or the euro, to a lesser extent to the British pound, as a medium of exchange. So you'd think if people thought that there's going to be an actual war, people would be dumping their hryvnias and buying euros and dollars, but they're not, because the currency is just, like I said, the currency exchange rate is rock steady. Fluctuates normally every day, a little bit up, a little bit down, but it's steady, okay? There are no like 15, 20, 25, 30% drops in a day. None of that shit's going on, okay? So that leads me to conclude that the people in Ukraine know that this is all posturing and nothing's going to happen, okay? But it's indicative of the leadership in the United States that they so want a war with Russia. They so want a war, okay? And this leads us to the next problem with American foreign policy, which is that foreign policy players are at odds with one another. See, there is one faction that are essentially pragmatists. A lot of what Donald Trump was doing was very pragmatic. He was looking at national interest, and he didn't give a shit about anything else, just national interest. Is this good for America or bad? Bad in the sense of, does it rob us of treasury, of influence, of time and effort? If it does, fuck it. If it's good for us, then let's do it. If we have to make friends with nasty people, fine, we'll make friends with nasty people. But if it's in our interest, we'll do so. And if it's not in our interest, we're not going to do so. That's a pragmatic approach. The realpolitik, what Henry Kissinger pushed back when he was sane. Now he's gone, he's an old crazy man, but I'll get to that in a moment. Because there are many more people in the foreign policy establishment that are essentially puppets of arms manufacturers or agents of foreign powers. Now, it's an ugly reality, but you have to face the facts that a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment of the United States and in the media that talks about foreign policy and influences foreign policy, a lot of them are agents of Israel and Saudi Arabia. More so of Israel than of Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis are very, very good at buying influence, okay? And these people, for various reasons, they are pushing for various wars. For instance, the animosity towards Russia, it's a very Jewish thing of hating the Russians because the Russians persecuted them for centuries, okay? And basically drove them out. Most Ashkenazi Jews are from Eastern Europe, and if not from Russia. And they were persecuted there by the Tsars and then the Commissars, okay? So they've always had a hatred for Russia. And before, when they were anti-communist, that's all good and fine. But now, they still hate the Russians with a passion. It's like a burning thing with them, okay? And the Israelis, they hate the Russians too. At the same time, they have to work with them, but they hate them. And they fear them. Because the Russians, they realize that they have to look after certain countries, especially Iran and Syria. And the Israelis have a hard-on for those territories. And so a lot of people in the United States in the foreign policy establishment are, for all intents and purposes, agents of the Israeli government, or they are agents of the Saudi Arabian government, okay? And therefore, they are pushing for wars with Russia because it is to their benefit. The Saudis want a war with Russia because it would interrupt the Russian oil flows. Natural gas flows, sure, but also the oil flows, because do keep in mind, Russia is one of the major oil-producing countries on the planet. All that oil in Siberia and shit. And so it's to the benefit of the Saudis if the Russian oil output is knocked out of the equation, because then it would drive up the price of Saudi oil, you see? And so there are a lot of vested interests in the American foreign policy establishment that really want a war with Russia, okay? It would be catastrophic for the United States, though. They would lose. They would lose badly, okay? Because they would be overextended, and it's in the Russians' backyard, literally their front yard, actually, okay? They would wipe them out. If the United States went to war, if the United States put a carrier group in the Black Sea, the Russians would wipe it out within the week. Because there are two issues with the Russians. See, it's not merely that they've got the manpower, and it's not merely that they've got the technology, which they do. Those hypersonic weapons and whatnot, that was developed by the Russians. The United States is playing catch-up with that shit, huh? The thing is, see, the Russians have something that the Americans do not have, and that is will. Putin is a very, very clever customer. He is, like I said before, the best geopolitical chess player on the planet, the best player alive, and probably the best one in quite a number of decades. Okay, he knows how to play the game. When he goes to war, it's always fast, clean, clear objectives. He knows how to go to war. He's gone to war before. In Georgia, he was in and out in a week and wiped out the opposition, defanged the country, and pacified it. He knows what he's doing. When he took over Crimea, same thing. Fast, clean, a clear victory. Okay? And so he could strut around and say, hey, I fucking won, because he did. Okay? He knows how to win. And he knows how to use the power of his opponents against them. Okay? He could hurt the Americans badly. And I think that some of the saner people in America, in the foreign policy and the military establishment, they know that. And they're scared of the Russians with good reason, because they are very, very clever and they are very tough. I mean, look, the German SS were the toughest soldiers in Europe, and the Russians beat them. Okay? I mean, that tells you all you need to know. Those fuckers are tough. They, the Russian winters, man, they teach them something, okay? So anyway, the American foreign policy players are at odds with one another, okay? And so this whole basket case that's going on. The other issue, of course, is the forever wars in the Middle East, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the point that's going on is that foreign policy, insofar as foreign policy is concerned, the United States is failing the challenges of its two biggest rivals. The military might of the Russians is not to be underestimated. The economic might of the Chinese is not to be underestimated. And what's most important of all, as I transition to the next point of this presentation, is their willpower. Because those fuckers, the Chinese and the Russians, they know exactly what they want. And they're not shy about getting it, grabbing it, and holding on to it, and fighting off anybody who doesn't like it, okay? They have will. They've got balls, okay? They've got balls and willpower and the brains to get what they want, okay? And most important of all, in both countries, there is absolutely unified leadership. Whatever you think of Putin, he's got that ship firmly in hand. It's his fucking country. And Xi and the Chinese Communist Party, it's their fucking country. Yeah. But in the United States, you've got an extreme power vacuum. You've got incredibly weak leadership. You have a doddering old